Yep, so welcome everybody. I'm Livia Bizikova. I am with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, leading a program called SDG Knowledge, SDG Sustainable Development Goals. But we have a strong interest also in working on indicators and measurement systems around sustainability or around kind of complex issues like resilience. I'm going to present the outcome of this project that really focused on trying to make indicators that could be used by policymakers that are not, high-level expert in crop management, high-level expert in climatology, but they could understand what's happening in a system that the agriculture activities are occurring in terms of if is the system resilient or not, and how we know it's resilient and what we can measure. So this work was done together with Ruth Waldick that Scott just introduced. She's in Victoria now, and also another colleague, Patricia Larkin, who looked at some of the health-related indicators in this setup. And I don't know how I will here.
Just the arrows.
Okay, so let's kind of go back to history. So this is kind of the beginning of adaptation research, and this is just one slide on history, so don't worry. So this is the 1970s, picture from a famous work of Canadian researcher Ian Burton, who talked about how with climate change the averages are shifting, and while the coping range that in this case crops, but other systems we're used to, or based on the past experiences, won't work in the future with climate change because the range is shifting. So therefore, you need a system that will able to address this shifting need somehow by itself or by helping to do so. And the helping to do so was basically by adapting. And in agriculture, which is kind of in my opinion, the origin of the adaptation research, when after this work we started to have that kind of work that talked about the farmers, those ones that are smart and those ones that are not that smart. And the smart ones, basically, they can adapt autonomously, meaning they somehow figure out what's happening in the climate, change their behavior and adapt to those changing ranges. And then we can actually help in the process of adaptation, especially if the range shift is too big, by doing targeted measures, which Ruth just talked about, let's say irrigation, in places where we haven't really done irrigation, different types of pest management, and all kinds of things to actually help encourage that adaptation that just by figuring out in a small scale by yourself may not be enough. Like you can think about this from your experience, let's say if you have flooding in your basement. At the beginning you can kind of figure it out and maybe you deal with it if it's not too much, but if it's too much then you actually have to plan for it from insurance to kind of construction in your basement to deal with the issue or moving. So those kind of things that are planned, that are adapted, kind of then started to take on the literature. So, but this kind of thinking led to something. So what we saw in the beginning, we kind of said that these days we have like, let's say 6 elements around the climate change research or adaptation and the response research. So we have something called resilience that we will be talking more today. We have risk assessments, we have the adaptation planning that I just talked about. We also have something called adaptive capacity, which is that farmer who adapts by himself or herself has something which is generally referred to adaptive capacity to respond. And that something could be simple as information. So they, let's say, check the weather forecast, seasonality, and they respond well. They could have money, so they can do things differently. Let's say they are for irrigation. They can use money to pay insurance. So capacity, they can work together with their neighbors, so they network. So there can be all kinds of things that people can have to respond. Then there was a lot on climate impact assessment, which basically we just assess how climate impact our system, but we haven't really thought about what to do. And then their vulnerability assessment, which you probably heard of because they probably made the biggest, also one of the biggest splash in the literature, that looked at how systems are vulnerable. So we are not saying what to do, but we kind of find out what's the problem in terms of climate change. The simple thing is low-lying areas or roads that are below, the water level in the next lake. So if it overflows, the roads get overflown. So that's a vulnerability assessment. So let's see. Oops. So now let's see, I try to order these into how these things happen. So maybe we can just talk a little bit about this, if this order is correct. So based on what I just showed at the beginning, so what do you think, and it's just for the audience here, but that's okay. What was kind of the first thing that started happening in this climate change adaptation, responding to climate change literature from all these things? Or maybe we can look here. From all these 6 things, the whole thing started? Was first the adaptive capacity literature? Was first the resilience literature?
Impact.
Yes, so it started with these impact assessments, and when you think of back, what was kind of the core, maybe you guys know, I'm just wondering, it's kind of a common thing. What was the core thing? You guys are doing masters in environmental science and climate-related stuff, meaning, yeah, no? Who has his thesis or her thesis related to climate change in this room? Agriculture? And then let's just do a quick round. So what's your focus work is? Yeah?
I look at shore expansion in the north and how that influences nutrient cycling.
Okay.
Doing hydrology for this project.
Okay, so there's a lot of climate. Haha. Yeah?
I just feel like farm structure and field size and how that impacts diversity. Not quite, I mean, it's affected by climate change, but that really wasn't the focus.
Okay, but so it's not that off. Next one, please. Yeah, please. Yeah.
In general, nothing specific in agriculture.
And then what is the focus?
Huh?
And then what's the focus if it's not agriculture?
It's quite general. Climate change is the key.
Oh, good. So that's good. Yeah?
Oh, I work for OMAFRA.
And on what?
Like it's general, like agriculture.
Oh, okay. So it's agriculture. Yeah?
I work with her, so I just work in general agriculture too with OMAFRA.
Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of general agriculture. If it accounts for climate change too, but I would assume yes. Yeah.
I'm still my undergrad. So.
And what's the focus? What you're interested in for your?
It will be in hydrology of glaciers at the moment.
Okay, so that's, glaciers are impacted by climate change. Okay, so yes, so they started with impact assessment. I know you too, so I was asking. So where, at least this is maybe you kind of have an understanding, where this impact assessment has been published over the year. The effort get a Nobel Prize at some point. It was the core set where we actually could read about climate impact in a way that it's very complicated to understand, but all things was there. And some of you that touch on climate change, you probably looked in your thesis, like the glacier work, it's right there. Do we know what was it?
Oh, I haven't done it yet. I'm still an undergrad. So.
But what was that institution that got a Nobel Prize a few years ago? It was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which publishes assessment every 5 years, and the first one was the first few were really focused on impact assessment. Okay, so now we understand the impact of climate change on the system. What would be the next step to do? We figured out like what Scott talked about, weather and those kind of things impact the agriculture. So what the next steps? What the next could be then? That might be something really important for OMAFRA. What would you do then?
What's vulnerable? What are the risks?
Exactly. So we need to understand how we are vulnerable. How the system is vulnerable. And then what would be the next? We know that the system is vulnerable this way, there is not enough water to irrigate.
To what degree can you adapt?
Yeah, to what degree can you adapt? And that could have two things. Do you have capacity to adapt? Do the farmers have the money? Do the farmers have the information? Those kind of things. Or there is a plan, and if it's a plan being implemented. So that would be the adaptation planning part. And then somewhere around there, we started to have risk assessments. It's somewhere around that time when we started to talk about not just vulnerability, but more generic risks. And risk also entered around the time of the financial crisis, when we realized that, say, farming and others are in danger of risks, not just climate, but risk to financial markets, risk to changing commodity prices, and other things could actually impact farmers hugely beyond just climate change. So that kind of risks was put broader. And then these days, what we talk about these days all the time? Resilience, exactly. So these days, kind of the new approach is resilience. And we talk about resilience not just in agricultural system, but we talk about resilience in our lives, how to be resilient when we make decisions, when we transition to new jobs. So it's all this new kind of language entered the kind of the word out there beyond the climate language. And now what we try to do is really look at how we would measure system resilience in the context of agriculture. So this is our framework, and maybe you've seen it earlier. So basically we try to really move from the impact part to looking at how the climate impacting the agricultural system, which you already heard about, what's the capacities, vulnerabilities of the system to respond, what are the adaptation needs, and now we move to the resilience. So we kind of venture through that historical cycle of climate change assessment. So what is resilience? So in a very narrow definition, resilience is something, the ability of the system to absorb shocks, meaning that the system, when it's, exposed to a shock like a drought, like a flood, pest, or something else, it won't fall apart, it won't collapse, but somehow finds internal resources to make it work. Further, in some of the development literature, there is more talks about that it's not necessarily just that the system could bounce back from the shock, but it could transform itself to some extent so that can function better when the next shocks come. So there's some learning in the system instead of just bouncing back how it was, and then if the shocks comes again, it's kind of going from one state to another. But you actually move to a new state that is more resilient. In terms of the resilience, because you're talking about the system and you're talking about having a shock to the system, obviously you have to think of many elements of the system. So you cannot just think of the agriculture, you think of the economy, you think of the society, because as I said, the agriculture could be impacted by, like Trump does something within the US and it influences our ability to export. It could be a similar shock to the system compared to, weather. So it definitely kind of one of the key features of the resilience is that you have to look at the bigger picture, look at not just the very narrow definition of your agriculture field or a farm, but kind of the broader picture. And then the other kind of questions that we try to ask in this context is, so what makes the system resilient? What are those elements of the system that actually can make it resilient? We're also talking about, something useful for policy making, so it cannot be an endless list because otherwise it's not feasible to implement. The second thing is how we can strengthen those elements that help build resilience. And other in this context of this question is also, are there any specific indicators or features of the system that undermine resilience? Very simple thing that could, let's say, undermine resilience, we could think of very hierarchical approaches. So if somebody faces a climate impact and they want to respond, but in order to employ a measure, they have to wait 6 months for approval, it's undermining the system, because until you wait for 6 months for approval, your system already collapsed. So these are kind of very simple, small things that could undermine the ability of the system to respond. So now, when you start thinking about the system, beyond just a kind of a very narrow agriculture thinking, of course, it immediately becomes obvious that you have to talk to diverse groups of stakeholders. And so in terms of these groups of stakeholders, so you have to look at some of the obvious agricultural players that we were reaching out, but also you have to look at, let's say, the communities here. So let's say City of Ottawa, different farmers' unions, crop producers that kind of unite different types of agricultural activities, and also looking at environment, looking at municipalities. So basically on the slide you can see the number of actors that were consulted in different phases of the research to provide inputs on their views of what the elements of the resilience indicator should be and how we should define them. So maybe just let's try to pause again and try to ask you some questions before we get into details. Let's say take a student. So you are students in different phases. What make a student resilient in your school year? Tell me some features. that we could say as an indicator? What helps you through through the year?
Funding.
Funding, perfect. Maybe let's try 2 other things.
Reading week?
Okay, so you have a time to study. So time to study, funding. What else? Let's try one thing more.
Peer support.
Exactly, friends, networks, yeah. And now when you look at this, so we take this as 3 indicators. So if you have funding, if the reading week you have time to study, and you have friends. Now, is this enough to describe the resilience of the student to go through the school year, or there could be other features? What these things how they need to work? Let's say with the friends. When you say peer support, what exactly? It's enough that you can say, I have 5 friends?
Sorry?
So is it enough to just say, I have 5 friends? Or there needs to be something a bit more?
Like the friends are going to do something for me?
Exactly. So they need to be available. They need to respond in a reasonable manner to your needs. And so that's kind of the thing when we think of resilience. So we're not just thinking about the system as these elements, but we need to think of the system as the elements are working well in a certain way to respond. So let's say exactly, if you have 2 friends, but they never pick up the phone or never, respond to your messages, then probably, it's not really resilience. You are somewhere there, but you need to strengthen. Same with the funding. If you have the funding, but for some reason it's super late, or it gets lost in the bank, then you have it, but it's not really working. And that's what resilience is about. So you have to understand the elements of the system, and then you have those elements, you need to make them work. And if you have the elements but they're not working, then it's not really resilience. You have the basis, but it's not there. So, and this is our system that you've probably seen. Yeah, so this is our system that we developed in the beginning to describe the system of the agriculture in the context of other issues. Now, one important thing with this was that when we think of resilience, we could basically define resilience indicators or some indicators to every box in the system. But because we were interested to be relevant for policymaking, the focus was really to identify those areas that are really most considered most relevant for the stakeholders in terms of addressing the resilience of the system. And so when you look at this diagram, from those that made it to the resilience indicator system are those that are in red circles. So these are the things that are included. So it includes information around the demography of the region. So we are not just interested in farmers, but also the broader demography, market and economic performance, obviously climate, some details on agricultural performance, some details on environmental characteristics of the systems, and also infrastructure. For us, infrastructure was one of those areas which, when we looked at this system, because we developed it like 2 years ago when the project started, infrastructure didn't really came up that strongly as an area for focus. So it's kind of there, but it's not a specific box. But over time, especially when we started looking at the resilience, the quality, the preparedness, the access to infrastructure seem to be very important characteristic to describe the resilience of the system. So if something happens, the system can respond. So from this, then we went through a process to find the indicators in literature, do a number of workshops, focus groups with key players to actually try to identify what are those indicators that are in the literature for resilience and match this priority list. Are suggested to be developed. And then we also looked at data availability and how the indicator set would be narrowed down. And so this is just the last slide. Oh, there's one more, but this is kind of the sum of the indicators. So we have a briefing note that lists on the indicators, and there's a peer-reviewed piece that should be submitted soon that lists the details. But so for now, we can say that we have basically from all the indicators and all the system elements that we identified, we basically identified 6 critical themes that came around 30 indicators to describe the system that really matters the resilience of the system. So from climate change, it was mostly focused on seasonality and weather, extreme weather, as the most important parts that could describe the changes in climate in terms of impacting the resilience of the system. So if the policymakers see that there is a series of extreme weathers occurring, there is an assumption that this means that there needs to be an action taken because this thing could impact the resilience of the system significantly. Other climate events may not that significantly. Rural population, so a lot of the agricultural areas are situated in rural population, so rural areas with rural population. So it means that from a point of view of responding as a system to climate impacts, we cannot just focus on the agriculture and agricultural land, but we need to look at the population that is located in those places. And here again, and it's kind of similar to the analogy with the friends. So what we are looking at is not like what the average population is, or like male-female distribution or family distribution, but we are looking at specific vulnerabilities that matter from a resilience point of view, which is age, health, income. So if we have a population there that is highly aged, that has low income or health issues, that has a much more significant impact from a resilience point of view than the generic number of people. Farmland and production, so this is which already Scott talked about a lot. So this is how the farm could respond to changing conditions. So we looked at in terms of the diversification of planting, animal production, and how that's impacting land use, market. So again, climate is one of the stressors, but other thing that makes the farming community viable is basically income or the cost and benefits. So there is, here again, we are not looking at, let's say, just income of the farmers, but we are looking at the ratio of debt and income stability to actually indicate the level of resilience. Rural infrastructure, I talked about that. If we have a degraded, unupdated rural infrastructure, that could significantly impact the ability to respond or undermine the ability to respond. And of course, environment and biodiversity. And again, here we look at very specific issues like, let's say, the rate of erosion or species conditions. So these are again things that significantly could impact the rate of erosion, the quality, or the ability to respond. So we are not looking at just, let's say, the amount of forest in the area or amount of grasslands, but we are really looking at very specific things. One of the outcomes of this work also led to kind of the process that we are hoping that while these indicators were developed in a very narrow Ontario setting of agricultural production, because they are so generic, so even in Manitoba you can talk about rural population structure within agriculture or the market or the infrastructure, even though you produce things differently and different things. So that because they are, to some extent, they can be generalized, they can also be transferred to another regions in Canada. And so now just one kind of very few conclusions on this. So one thing is really critical in terms of agriculture, which we feel is that there is, we focus a lot on agriculture and climate. There is also the whole issue of climate, agriculture, and markets, and how the agriculture and the production and the climate impact influences the kind of the viability, the economic viability from the farmer's point of view. There is also now what maybe Scott talked about, a lot of interest and more work on extreme events to add to it, because it's relatively new in the applied research. I'm sure climatologists and other people did a lot of work on that, but to go out from that narrow focus to actually other areas. There is also basically a need to start more that integration that agriculture is actually part of a community landscape where there are people and other activities and not just kind of the farmland and the production. And so that type of thinking to integrate more when we measure impacts of agriculture or when we suggest how to remediate things. And finally, we haven't looked much at policies. So one part of the resilience thinking could also be, that there is a policy that helps farmers to get knowledge, to adapt, to respond. And we haven't really looked at impacts of those policies or anyway evaluated these policies, but also that's something that could, indicate if you have a policy that indeed helps farmers to respond in different ways, that could be included in some of these resilient types of indicators. And there are studies where they're much more focused on the policies, but somehow for us, focusing the things on the ground, either people or the agricultural system, was more important than looking at the policy and the evaluation of the impacts of the policies. Thank you, and I maybe ask Ruth if you want to add something, because we worked really closely together on these results and the papers.
Yeah, sure, Livia. I guess one of the things that I'd like to add to this is that the indicators, I mean, it was very interesting to see as we went through discussions with all the stakeholders that these coarser level objectives, mostly which were environmental, by taking this kind of more holistic approach, ended up in this selection of very specific, more, as Livia said, more infrastructure-based indicators. Do we have the means to respond to these environmental stressors or insults that we're concerned about? And then who's responsible, and which sectors have various capacities to deal with these kind of problems. And then some of the commonalities across the different sectors came out. So I'm just looking at the briefing note, Livia. I don't know if you have copies there or not, but I think one of the things for me that was a really good addition was working with public health and health, because there's the links between the different sectors become more apparent to everybody when you start talking about health, because agriculture, heavy precipitation, what's going on in the agricultural landscape are linked to different kinds of health indicators, but the health sector doesn't necessarily have a means to factor this in. So when we were getting more into this literature, what was interesting is the direct relevance of the indicators to more than one sector. So certain aspects of heavy precipitation or these kind of extreme events that we might be looking at have equivalently important meanings for different sectors. So whether it's public health, agriculture in terms of production or operations on the farm, or for the conservation authorities or municipalities who are managing their water systems for public health purposes, but also for as a resource. So in the end, the list of the shorter list, I don't know if you know offhand, Livia, what those were. You had 200 and something up there on your list, but we reduced
yeah,
it quite
it says 25. Yes, I think it's between 25, 30. The final.
So this is so in this process, we were able to, although we increased the number of sectors that we were considering and disciplines that were kind of reviewed, in the end, the number of more specific resilience type indicators of how a community or a sector can respond ended up being relatively small. And the other comment that I wanted to make, which I think is also very relevant, is that a number of these indicators of the over 200 simply couldn't be calculated. So there's all of these data issues, and maybe it can be calculated to some extent. Is it going to be useful in terms of planning and adaptation and figuring out how you would need to respond to it at the resolution of information that you need? And when you cut those out, that we simply don't have this kind of information available for, then you end up with a smaller subset. But just to look at the data availability, from the list, 31% of the indicators had data available, but another 33% had data available, but calculation was required. So this is kind of akin to the presentation that Dan gave when he's showing that here are the census data, which is aggregate, and we have to do a little bit of work with these data in order to extrapolate it and interpret it in terms of so a landscape classification scale or individual farms and fields. So this is not to say that it's not possible, but if more sectors have to share their data, then you need to have this sort of networking going on. But even still, that's just those two categories. That's 64% of the indicators that we looked at could be calculated. So I just want to make this point because very often people say that there aren't data available. And I think this whole project, to me, when I started the Farms to Regions, what I was thinking as a scientist is there's enough data to do something. So I just wanted to kind of, bring that around here, that often we think we need more data. But the whole point of the scenario-based approach, the Envision tool, and despite the shortcomings of how the data has had to be interpreted and the assumptions that have had to be built in across all the different presentations and elements that are part of this, there's a lot of data and there's a lot that can be said from that, particularly in terms of policy and planning perspectives, as long as you know what the specific question is. And in the end, we know we're looking at something more like 25 indicators that I don't know how many different fields that would cover, Livia. I mean, it's public health, agriculture, different kind of economic indicators, municipal planning, sort of communities, environmental ones, as well as climate. So there's a whole, this information is relevant to a whole bunch of different sectors. And I think making agriculture more relevant is also another important element of working across disciplines like this, because they also affect agriculture, the municipalities and so forth. So I guess that's sort of my observation from the work that Livia and I had been doing through this process, thinking about this, which was different for me as a scientist.
Thanks, Ruth. That was really good. Do you want to just mention that the peer-reviewed article, we never know when peer review is going to finish, but that's part of the point of having a briefing note, so that information is supposed to come out any day now, right?
Yeah, so the briefing note maybe should be up even today or tomorrow, so I can send you the link and you can just,
And I know at the beginning of this call, Patricia was on and warned that she was going to have to come and go. Are you there now, Patricia? Okay, just wanted to see if she had a comment to make. All right, that's good. Any questions or comments for these people? That machine turned off. All right, thanks very much, Livia.